The year is 1274. A colossal Mongol invasion fleet cuts through the dark waters of the Korea Strait, its destination the remote island of Tsushima, Japan's first line of defense. The armada stretches across the horizon, hundreds of ships carrying a multinational force of Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and conscripted Korean soldiers. This is the spearhead of Kublai Khan's grand design to bring the land of the rising sun under Mongol dominion. On Tsushima, a handful of samurai prepare for what they know will be their final battle. Led by the island's governor, Sō Sukekuni, approximately 80 mounted warriors and their retainers, perhaps 300 men in total, stand ready to face an invasion force that outnumbers them by hundreds to one. They have no illusions about their fate. Reinforcements will not come. Victory is impossible. Yet they choose to fight, embodying the warrior code that will later be known as Bushidō. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold on the beaches of Tsushima, we must first journey west to the heart of Asia, where a power had risen unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. The Mongol Empire was forged on the steppes by the military genius of Genghis Khan, who united the fractious Mongol tribes through a combination of brutal warfare and innovative military organization. By 1260, his grandson Kublai Khan ruled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Carpathian Mountains of Eastern Europe, an empire encompassing roughly 12 million square miles and containing perhaps 25% of the world's population. Kublai was no mere nomad chieftain. After establishing the Yuan Dynasty in China in 1271, he ruled from his magnificent summer capital at Xanadu, Shangdu, a city that would later inspire Coleridge's famous poem. His winter capital at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, rivaled any court in the world for its sophistication and wealth. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo, who served in Kublai's court from 1275 to 1292, described the Khan as the most potent man, as regards subjects and territory and treasure, that existeth in the world. Any might of the deaf. The Mongols possessed a worldview that brooked no compromise. Heaven had decreed that the entire world should fall under their domain. In their conception, there were no truly independent nations, only those who had submitted to Mongol rule and those who remained in a state of rebellion. This ideology, known as the Mandate of Heaven, provided both justification and compulsion for endless expansion. Japan represented the most tantalizing prize on the eastern frontier. Chinese and Korean merchants spoke of it as a land rich in gold, where even common soldiers carried weapons adorned with precious metals. The Golden Country promised wealth beyond imagination. Strategically, conquering Japan would cut off potential escape routes for Song dynasty loyalists and eliminate a possible base for future resistance. But beyond practical considerations, Japan's defiance was a personal affront to the Great Khan's authority, an intolerable challenge to the cosmic order. The Mongol military machine was arguably the most sophisticated and effective fighting force of its era. Their commanders were masters of combined arms warfare, coordinating vast formations of heavy cavalry, light horse archers, Chinese crossbowmen, and Korean naval specialists. They moved with terrifying precision, responding to signals from horns, drums, and banners across distances that would have made communication impossible for other armies. The Mongol tactical arsenal included psychological warfare refined to an art form. They would drive prisoners before them as human shields, construct towers from the skulls of the defeated, and spread tales of their own invincibility to demoralize enemies before battle was even joined. Entire cities that resisted would be razed, their populations enslaved or slaughtered as object lessons to others. Most significantly, the Mongols had mastered the use of gunpowder weapons imported from China. They deployed early grenades called iron bombs, ceramic or metal shells packed with gunpowder and fragments of iron or pottery. These could be thrown by hand or launched from catapults, exploding with deafening roars that could shatter both formations and morale. They also used larger bombs launched from trebuchets and early rocket-like projectiles that could terrorize horses and inexperienced troops. This was the force now turning its attention to Japan, a military juggernaut that had crushed the Khwarezmid Empire, conquered the Western Xia, toppled the Jin dynasty, and was in the process of eliminating the last remnants of Song resistance in southern China. Across the sea, 13th century Japan existed as a world unto itself. Under the military government known as the Kamakura shogunate, established in 1185 by Minamoto no Yoritomo, Japan was ruled by a warrior aristocracy that had developed its own unique culture of warfare and honor. The samurai class emerged during the Heian period, 7941-185, as provincial warriors serving the great noble houses. Over time, they had evolved into a distinct social caste with their own values, traditions, and code of conduct. By the 13th century, this warrior ethos was crystallizing into what would later be formalized as Bushidō, the way of the warrior. For the samurai, war was not merely a contest of strength or strategy, it was a ritualized expression of personal honor and ancestral legacy. Battles traditionally began with formal challenges, where individual warriors would ride forth, announce their names and lineages, and call for worthy opponents to face them in single combat. This was warfare as both art form and spiritual practice, where the manner of fighting was as important as victory itself. The samurai were masters of the bow and the curved sword, weapons that reflected their emphasis on individual skill and craftsmanship. A samurai's bow, often made from bamboo and wood laminated with sinew, could drive an arrow through armor at considerable distances. Their swords, forged using techniques that combined hard and soft steel, were legendary for their sharpness and resilience. Each blade was considered to possess a soul of its own. Samurai armor, while beautiful, was also highly functional. The yoroi of this period featured iron and leather plates laced together with silk cords, providing excellent protection while allowing for mobility on horseback. The distinctive horned helmet and facial armor gave the samurai a fearsome appearance while protecting vital areas. However, this proud warrior culture had developed in isolation from the continental methods of warfare that were transforming military practice across Asia. Japan's geographic separation had protected it from foreign invasion for centuries, allowing its military traditions to evolve along distinctly Japanese lines. The samurai had no experience with mass formations, coordinated cavalry charges, siege warfare with gunpowder weapons, or the kind of total war that the Mongols practiced. The Kamakura shogunate, led by the Hōjō clan as regents for puppet shoguns, ruled through a feudal system that distributed land to loyal retainers in exchange for military service. This decentralized structure made Japan difficult to govern from the center, but also resilient against external threats if the invaders could be met and contained. The first contact between the Mongol Empire and Japan came not through violence but through diplomacy, though diplomacy of a particularly ominous kind. In 1266, Kublai Khan dispatched his first embassy to Japan, carried by Korean ships to the island of Tsushima and then to the mainland. The Khan's letter, written in Chinese characters, was a masterpiece of veiled threats dressed in the language of benevolent concern. It read, in part, "The Emperor of the Great Mongol Empire sends this letter to the King of Japan. From ancient times, small countries that are situated near each other have sought friendship with one another. We hope that the friendly relationship between our two countries will be established. It would be difficult for us to cross the vast ocean to attack you, and it would be equally difficult for you to cross the ocean to attack us. But if you do not come to pay tribute to us, we will attack you." The message was clear: submit voluntarily or face conquest. For the Mongol Khan, this was standard procedure. Most nations, faced with the choice between submission and annihilation, chose the former. The Japanese response was unprecedented in Mongol experience: silence. The shogunate's Council of Regents, led by Hōjō Tokimune, debated the letter extensively, but reached a unanimous conclusion: Japan would not become a vassal state. They would send no tribute, acknowledge no superior, and offer no reply whatsoever to the Khan's demands. This dismissive silence was calculated to be as insulting as possible within the context of East Asian diplomacy, where even rejecting a proposal required formal acknowledgement. The Japanese were sending a clear message. They did not recognize the Mongol Empire's authority to make demands of Japan. Kublai Khan, perhaps expecting that the Japanese needed time to consider their position, sent additional embassies in 1268 and 1269. Each time, the result was the same contemptuous silence. Some sources suggest that the final embassy's members were executed, though this remains disputed among historians. Whether or not the envoys were killed, the message was unmistakable. Japan would not submit. For Kublai Khan, this defiance was intolerable. No nation had ever consistently refused to even acknowledge Mongol authority, let alone rejected it so completely. The failure of diplomacy left only one alternative: invasion. The order went out across the Mongol Empire: assemble a fleet capable of conquering Japan. The primary staging area was the Korean peninsula, where the recently conquered Goryeo kingdom was compelled to provide ships, sailors, and soldiers for the invasion. Historical sources vary in their estimates of the invasion force's size, reflecting both the incomplete nature of 13th century record-keeping and the tendency of chroniclers to inflate numbers for dramatic effect. Chinese and Korean records suggest the fleet numbered between 800 and 900 vessels of various sizes, while Japanese sources often claim numbers exceeding 1,000 ships. Modern historians generally estimate the total invasion force for 1,274 at between 23,000 and 40,000 men, though some sources push this number higher. The army was truly multinational. Mongol cavalry formed the elite corps. Chinese infantry provided disciplined foot soldiers experienced in siege warfare, and Korean forces contributed both land troops and naval expertise. The fleet itself represented a remarkable logistical achievement. The largest vessels were Chinese-style junks, multi-masted ships capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers and supplies. Medium-sized Korean ships provided reconnaissance and support, while smaller craft served as transports and landing vessels. Many of these ships, however, were river vessels or coastal traders pressed into service for open ocean navigation, a factor that would prove crucial later. The invasion plan was methodical and typically Mongol in its thoroughness. The fleet would first seize the strategic islands between Korea and Kyushu, Tsushima, Iki, and potentially smaller islands that could serve as forward bases. Once these outposts were secured, the main force would land on Kyushu at Hakata Bay, establish a beachhead, and begin the systematic conquest of Japan. Commanding this vast enterprise were experienced Mongol generals who had participated in the conquest of Song China. Liu Fuheng, a Chinese general who had surrendered to the Mongols, served as overall commander, while Hong Dagu, a Mongol prince, led the cavalry forces. The Korean Admiral Yi Eonjun commanded the naval elements, bringing crucial knowledge of Japanese waters. Tsushima Island, lying roughly halfway between Korea and Japan, was perfectly positioned to serve as either Japan's first line of defense or the Mongols' first conquest. The island, approximately 30 miles long and 10 miles wide, featured rugged terrain with steep hills, dense forests, and rocky coastlines punctuated by small beaches suitable for landing craft. The island's strategic importance was matched by its economic value. Tsushima served as a crucial link in trade between Japan and the Asian mainland, and its people had developed extensive contacts with Korean merchants and diplomats. This commercial relationship would prove tragically relevant, as many Koreans serving with the Mongol fleet were familiar with the island's geography and defenses. Governing Tsushima was Sō Sukekuni, a 6-7-year-old samurai who had spent decades administering the island for the Kamakura shogunate. The Sō clan had controlled Tsushima since the 12th century, building their power through a combination of military service, diplomatic skill, and commercial acumen. Sukekuni was no mere provincial administrator. He was an experienced warrior who had fought in the Genpei War and other conflicts of the late Heian period. His military resources, however, were pitifully inadequate for the task at hand. Tsushima's garrison consisted of approximately 80 mounted samurai, primarily members of the Sō clan and their immediate retainers, supported by perhaps 200 300 ashigaru, and armed peasants. These men were skilled warriors within the Japanese tradition, but they had never faced an enemy employing continental warfare techniques. The samurai of Tsushima were typical of their class, mounted archers who combined exceptional skill with traditional weapons with an unwavering commitment to personal honor. Many had inherited their positions from fathers and grandfathers who had served the Sō family for generations. They knew every hill and valley of their island home, and they were prepared to die defending it. As reports of the approaching Mongol fleet reached Tsushima, Sukekuni faced an impossible decision. He could attempt to evacuate the civilian population to the mainland, but this would leave the island undefended and provide the Mongols with an intact base of operations. He could try to negotiate, but his instructions from the shogunate were clear: resist any attempt at invasion. Or he could stand and fight, knowing that defeat was inevitable but hoping that resistance might buy precious time for Japan to prepare. On the 4th of November 1274, lookouts on Tsushima's peaks spotted the first elements of the Mongol fleet on the horizon. What they saw must have been terrifying. Hundreds of vessels spread across the sea, their sails darkening the water as far as the eye could see. The invasion of Japan was about to begin. That same evening, as if summoned by the approaching crisis, fire broke out at the island's shrine dedicated to Hachiman, the Shinto deity of war and divine protection. For Sukekuni, this was no mere coincidence, it was a divine warning, a call to prepare for the ultimate test of samurai valor. Hachiman held special significance for the samurai class. Originally a syncretic deity combining Shinto and Buddhist elements, Hachiman had become closely associated with the Minamoto clan and their victory in the Genpei War. The god was believed to guide the arrows of righteous warriors and protect those who died honorably in battle. The fire at his shrine could be interpreted as either a warning of disaster or a signal that the deity was preparing to intervene on behalf of the defenders. Sukekuni gathered his samurai at the burning shrine, where they performed their final preparations according to ancient custom. Many composed death poems, brief verses that captured their state of mind before battle. These poems, typically written in the classical tanka or haiku forms, reflected the Buddhist and Confucian influences on samurai culture, expressing acceptance of fate while affirming commitment to duty. The samurai also engaged in ritual purification, cleansing themselves spiritually and physically for what many believed would be their journey to the afterlife. They donned their finest armor, inspected their weapons one final time, and said farewell to family members who would not see them again. As dawn approached on the 5th of November, Sukekuni led his small band through the darkness toward Komoda Beach on the island's northwestern coast, the most likely landing site for the invasion fleet. They rode in silence through the pre-dawn mist, each man alone with his thoughts and prayers. The first Mongol landing craft hit the sand of Komoda Beach as the sun rose on the 5th of November 1274. The invasion of Japan had begun. Sukekuni, adhering to samurai tradition even in this desperate hour, may have attempted to initiate formal combat procedures. Some accounts suggest he rode forward under a truce banner, seeking to arrange the ritualized combat that traditionally began Japanese battles. If such an approach occurred, it was met not with reciprocal courtesy but with a volley of arrows that sent the elderly governor scrambling back to his lines. The cultural clash was immediate and profound. One Japanese warrior, determined to begin the battle according to proper custom, rode forward and loosed a hikim, a special arrow with a bulbous head designed to make a whistling sound that traditionally signaled the start of combat. Standing in his stirrups, he shouted his challenge in classical form: "I am Name, descendant of ancestor, servant of the Sō clan, and I seek a worthy opponent to test my skills in honorable combat." The Mongols reportedly responded with confusion and then derisive laughter. This was not how war was conducted in their experience. War was about achieving objectives efficiently, not about personal honor or ancestral glory. Without warning, their archers unleashed a coordinated storm of arrows, turning the lone challenger into a pincushion before he could even draw his sword. In that moment, Sukekuni understood that this was not a battle between individual warriors. This was a collision between two entirely different conceptions of warfare. The Mongols fought to win by any means necessary. The samurai fought to uphold an ideal that the enemy neither understood nor respected. Realizing that tradition was not only meaningless here but actively suicidal, Sukekuni abandoned centuries of military protocol and gave the order that would define his legacy: a full, desperate, suicidal charge straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The 80 samurai of Tsushima, supported by their retainers and foot soldiers, crashed into the Mongol front lines like a breaking wave against a sea wall. For a few brief shining moments, the ferocity of their charge stunned the invaders and drove them backward. The samurai's superior armor proved its worth in the initial clash. Their yoroi, with its layered construction of iron and leather plates, deflected arrows and sword blows that would have killed less well-protected warriors. Their razor-sharp katana, forged using techniques that combined hard and soft steel, cut through the lighter armor of Chinese infantry like silk. Several high-ranking Mongol officers fell in the first moments of the charge, victims of the samurai's superior individual combat skills. For a brief instant, it seemed possible that martial valor might triumph over overwhelming odds. But this was no ordinary battle, and the Mongols were no ordinary enemy. Their commanders quickly adapted to the new situation, using their vast numerical superiority to encircle the small Japanese force while maintaining disciplined formations that the individual heroics of the samurai could not break. The Mongol response demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had conquered half the known world. Light cavalry moved to threaten the samurai's flanks, while Chinese crossbowmen provided suppressing fire from carefully chosen positions. Korean naval infantry landed additional forces to prevent any possibility of retreat. Then came the weapons that the samurai had never encountered, the tetsuhau or iron bombs. These early grenades, packed with gunpowder and metal fragments, exploded with deafening roars that terrified the Japanese horses and riders alike. The samurai's mounts, trained for traditional warfare but never exposed to gunpowder weapons, panicked and threw their riders or fled in terror. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. The explosions created clouds of smoke and flame that seemed almost supernatural to warriors who had never seen gunpowder weapons. Combined with the incessant beating of war drums and the sound of Mongol war cries in unfamiliar languages, the battlefield became a hellscape of noise and confusion. As the samurai charge faltered and broke apart, the Mongols methodically isolated individual warriors and overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. The beach at Komoda became a slaughter ground, with Japanese bodies piling up among the black sand and rocks. Trapped against the sea with no hope of escape, the samurai of Tsushima refused to break and run. Their code demanded that they fight to the death, and they would not dishonor their ancestors by abandoning their posts. One by one, they fell. Sō Sukekuni, the 6-7-year-old governor, fought at the head of his men until the very end. Contemporary accounts describe him leading one final hopeless charge into the densest concentration of enemy forces, his war cry echoing across the beach as he disappeared into the mass of Mongol warriors. The last stand at Tsushima lasted perhaps an hour, though to the participants it must have seemed both an eternity and an instant. When the fighting finally ended, virtually every one of the samurai defenders lay dead on the blood-soaked sand. A few retainers and foot soldiers may have survived by fleeing into the island's interior, but the organized resistance was completely annihilated. The Mongols had achieved their first objective, but not without cost. While their losses were relatively light compared to the Japanese casualties, the ferocity of the defense had surprised and perhaps unnerved some of the invasion force. These Japanese were clearly not going to be easily conquered. During the height of the battle at Komoda Beach, a few small fishing boats managed to slip away from Tsushima's harbors, carrying perhaps the most important cargo in Japanese history, news of the invasion. These humble vessels, crewed by local fishermen who knew every current and tide, managed to evade the Mongol naval patrols and reach the mainland. The message they carried was simple but earth-shaking. The invasion has begun. Tsushima has fallen. The Mongols are coming. This warning, purchased with the blood of Sō Sukekuni and his samurai, would prove crucial to Japan's ultimate survival. Racing from port to port along the Kyushu coast, the messengers spread word of the Mongol landing and the new type of warfare the invaders employed. For the first time, Japanese commanders learned about gunpowder weapons, massed archery, and the Mongol tactical system. With the island's defenders eliminated, the Mongol forces proceeded to demonstrate why their empire was feared across 2 continents. Following their standard practice, they systematically devastated Tsushima as both a practical measure and an object lesson for other potential resistors. The civilian population, which had hidden in the island's interior during the battle, was hunted down without mercy. Men were either killed outright or enslaved for use as laborers and human shields in future battles. Women and children suffered even worse fates, with mass rape and enslavement being standard Mongol practice in conquered territories. The island's temples, shrines, and administrative buildings were burned to the ground. Livestock was slaughtered or confiscated, crops were destroyed, and anything of value was loaded onto the Mongol ships. Within days, Tsushima had been transformed from a prosperous trading center into a charred wasteland. This destruction served multiple purposes within Mongol strategic thinking. It eliminated Tsushima as a potential base for Japanese resistance, provided supplies for the invasion force, and created refugees who would spread terror throughout Kyushu. Most importantly, it sent a clear message. This is what happens to those who resist the will of the great Khan. From Tsushima, the Mongol armada moved northeast to the island of Iki, the second stepping stone on their path to the Japanese mainland. If they had hoped that news of Tsushima's fate would encourage submission, they were disappointed. Iki was defended by another small garrison of samurai, led by Taira Kagetaka, a descendant of the famous Taira clan that had ruled Japan before the rise of the Minamoto. Like Sukekuni before him, Kagetaka commanded only a handful of warriors against an invasion force of thousands. The battle at Iki followed a similar pattern to the slaughter at Tsushima, though the defenders may have benefited slightly from advance warning about Mongol tactics. Some accounts suggest that the samurai tried to avoid the open-field combat that had proved so disastrous at Komoda Beach, instead attempting to use the island's terrain to their advantage. These tactical adaptations, however, were too little and too late. The Mongols had overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and tactical flexibility. After a brief but fierce resistance, Iki's defenders were annihilated just as thoroughly as their comrades on Tsushima. Taira Kagetaka himself became the subject of later legend when, according to some accounts, he was captured alive and tortured by the Mongols in an attempt to extract information about Japanese defenses. When he refused to cooperate, he was reportedly executed in a particularly brutal manner designed to terrorize other potential resistors. Like Tsushima before it, Iki was systematically devastated. The population was enslaved or massacred, buildings were burned, and resources were seized for the invasion force. Another Japanese island had been wiped from the map. By mid-November 1274, the Mongol armada approached its primary objective, the shores of Kyushu itself. The chosen landing site was Hakata Bay, near the modern city of Fukuoka, which offered excellent anchorage and access to the interior of the island. However, the situation the Mongols found at Hakata Bay was dramatically different from what they had encountered on the smaller islands. Thanks to the warning carried by the survivors from Tsushima, the Japanese mainland had had precious days to prepare for the invasion. The Kyushu samurai who gathered to oppose the landing were better informed about Mongol tactics and more numerous than the island garrisons. Crucially, they had abandoned the individual combat traditions that had proved so disastrous at Tsushima and Iki, instead adopting more flexible guerrilla-style tactics better suited to fighting an enemy that ignored the traditional rules of warfare. Rather than meeting the Mongols in open battle, the Japanese launched a series of hit-and-run attacks designed to harass the invaders and prevent them from establishing a secure beachhead. Small bands of samurai would strike at Mongol landing parties, inflict casualties, and then retreat before superior numbers could be brought to bear. Most effective of all were the nighttime naval raids conducted by small Japanese boats. These attacks targeted the closely packed Mongol fleet as it lay at anchor in Hakata Bay, with Japanese warriors swarming aboard the larger vessels to set them afire before disappearing into the darkness. These tactics, reminiscent of modern special operations, were completely unlike traditional samurai warfare, but proved devastatingly effective against an enemy expecting conventional resistance. The Mongol commanders, perhaps shocked by the unexpected effectiveness of Japanese guerrilla tactics or concerned about their supply situation, decided to consolidate their position rather than pressing inland immediately. Their massive fleet, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of men, anchored in the relatively confined waters of Hakata Bay. This decision, tactically sound in many respects, would prove to be a fatal error. The Mongol vessels, many of them flat-bottomed rivercraft or coastal traders pressed into service for the invasion, were poorly suited for extended operations in open ocean waters. Packed together in the bay, they presented a perfect target for both Japanese raiders and the weather itself. As night fell on November 1920, 1274, the weather began to deteriorate rapidly. The wind picked up, the seas grew rough, and what started as a typical autumn storm quickly developed into something far more dangerous. The Japanese would give this storm a name that would echo through history: Kamikaze, the divine wind. Modern meteorologists believe the storm was likely a powerful typhoon, the kind of weather system that regularly strikes the Japanese islands during late fall. However, its timing could not have been more perfect from the Japanese perspective or more disastrous for the Mongol fleet. The Mongol ships, anchored close together for mutual protection, became death traps as the storm intensified. Vessels were driven into each other, their hulls cracking and splitting under the impact. Others were pushed onto the rocky shores of Hakata Bay, where they broke apart in the pounding surf. The flat-bottom designs that made many of the ships stable in rivers and coastal waters became liabilities in the deep ocean swells. Thousands of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean soldiers drowned in the dark waters of the bay. Others managed to reach shore, only to be hunted down by Japanese patrols. The proud armada that had seemed invincible just days before was reduced to scattered wreckage, washing up on Japanese beaches. By dawn on the 20th of November 1274, the Mongol invasion of Japan was over. The survivors of the fleet, perhaps one-third of the original force, limped back toward Korea with their dreams of easy conquest shattered. The myth of Mongol invincibility, so carefully cultivated across two continents, had been broken on the shores of an island nation that most of the world barely knew existed. The retreat was a disaster in its own right. Many of the surviving ships were damaged and barely seaworthy, leading to additional losses during the journey back to Korea. The Chinese and Korean chronicles of the period record the return of demoralized, wounded survivors who brought tales of fierce Japanese resistance and divine intervention. For Kublai Khan, the failure of the 1274 invasion was a personal humiliation unlike anything he had experienced. The great Khan, who had conquered China and ruled an empire spanning continents, had been defeated by a relatively small island nation on the periphery of his domain. In Japan, the aftermath of the Mongol invasion saw a remarkable transformation of the narrative surrounding the Battle of Tsushima. What had been, by any objective measure, a catastrophic military defeat was gradually transformed into something approaching a spiritual victory. Sō Sukekuni and his 80 samurai, who had been wiped out almost without inflicting significant casualties on their enemies, were now remembered as heroes who had bought precious time for Japan's ultimate salvation. Their sacrifice had enabled the warning to reach the mainland, allowing Japanese forces to prepare for the invasion and ultimately contributing to its failure. The story of Tsushima became interwoven with the legend of the kamikaze, creating a powerful national myth that Japan was a divine land protected by its gods and defended by warriors of unparalleled courage. The fact that the samurai had been defeated became less important than the manner of their defeat, facing impossible odds with unwavering courage and dying before surrendering or retreating. This narrative transformation served important psychological and political functions. It provided the Japanese people with heroes to rally around, demonstrated the effectiveness of resistance even against seemingly impossible odds, and reinforced the idea that Japan was somehow special, chosen by the gods for protection against foreign invaders. The threat to Japan was far from over. An enraged Kublai Khan immediately began preparations for a second, even larger invasion. This time, there would be no underestimating Japanese resistance and no relying on a single fleet. The second invasion, launched in 1281, dwarfed its predecessor in every respect. Some Chinese sources claim the combined fleet numbered over 4,400 vessels, carrying more than 140,000 troops, though modern historians generally estimate the force at between 100,000 and 150,000 men. This armada approached Japan in two separate divisions, the Eastern Army, sailing directly from Korea, and the Southern Army, launching from southern China. However, Japan had learned crucial lessons from the first invasion. The Kamakura shogunate had used the intervening years to strengthen coastal defenses, construct walls along vulnerable beaches, and develop new tactics specifically designed to counter Mongol advantages. Most importantly, they had abandoned the individual combat traditions that had proved so disastrous in 1274. When the second invasion force arrived in Japanese waters, it found a very different reception. The Japanese had built extensive fortifications along the Kyushu coast, including a stone wall several miles long that protected Hakata Bay. They had also developed new fighting techniques that emphasized group tactics over individual heroism. The 1281 invasion became a prolonged siege rather than the quick conquest Kublai Khan had envisioned. For weeks, Mongol forces struggled to establish secure beachheads against determined Japanese resistance. The defenders, learning from their previous experience, avoided open-field battles and instead relied on defensive positions, night raids, and guerrilla tactics to wear down the invaders. Once again, however, it was the weather that provided the decisive blow. On August 1516, 1281, another massive typhoon struck the invasion fleet. This storm was even more devastating than its predecessor, destroying much of the Mongol armada and drowning tens of thousands of soldiers. The second kamikaze had struck, and with it, Kublai Khan's dreams of conquering Japan died forever. The story of Sō Sukekuni and his samurai represents one of history's great paradoxes, a complete military defeat that became a profound spiritual and cultural victory. By any conventional measure, the defense of Tsushima was a failure. The garrison was wiped out, the island was conquered, and the invasion proceeded as planned. Yet the legacy of that last stand transcended its immediate military consequences. The 80 samurai who died on Komoda beach became symbols of everything the warrior class aspired to be: loyal, brave, and willing to sacrifice their lives for honor and duty. Their story became a cornerstone of the samurai ethos, told and retold for generations as an example of perfect warrior virtue. The financial and social strain of defending against two Mongol invasions would contribute to significant changes in Japanese society, including the eventual collapse of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333. However, the successful defense also reinforced Japan's sense of divine protection and cultural superiority, contributing to a xenophobic isolationism that would last for centuries. The legend of the kamikaze would take on particular significance in the 20th century, when Japanese military leaders invoked the divine wind tradition to justify suicide attacks against Allied forces during World War II. While this later militaristic interpretation bears little resemblance to the actual events of 1274 and 1281, it demonstrates the enduring power of the Tsushima story to inspire and motivate. Perhaps most importantly, the last stand at Tsushima proved that even the world's greatest empire could be defied. The Mongols had conquered territories from Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia,